Sumita Kareer, and if startups, technology, emerging businesses and the new economy interests you, well then this is the show you should be watching to keep a track of all the developments in the space. Now we're telling the story of India's entrepreneurial system like no one else, so if there's anything that's happening in the world of startups, it's all happening right here on Startup Central or SUC, and do share your thoughts with us at suc@etnow.tv, given that we thrive on constructive feedback. On the show today, we take a look at India's space tech startup ecosystem and whether that's ready to shoot for the skies and what will further give the ecosystem a lift-off and a boost. All right, in fact, there was a space technology event happening in the national capital where the Minister of Space, Jitendra Singh, was speaking. Let's hear out his views on where he sees the growth of India's space tech ecosystem.
हमारे वैज्ञानिकों की प्रतिभा और उनकी योग्यता, उनकी प्रतिबद्धता, उनके परिश्रम का कमाल है कि साउथ पोल पर पहुंचने वाले मिशन हिंदुस्तान का था। और मैं ये कहूँगा कि इसकी सबसे अधिक यदि श्रेय जाता है तो प्रधानमंत्री मोदी जी को। 60-70 वर्ष तक हमारा अंतरिक्ष का क्षेत्र साधनों के अभाव तले काम करता रहा। मोदी जी ने क्रांतिकारी निर्णय लेते हुए इसको उन बंदिशों से आज़ाद किया, पब्लिक प्राइवेट पार्टिसिपेशन की अनुमति दी और उसके प्रमाण आपके सामने हैं। देखते ही देखते 3-4 वर्ष के भीतर जहां 1-2 स्टार्टअप्स हुआ करते थे स्पेस सेक्टर में, आज बढ़कर के उनकी संख्या लगभग 300 हो गई।
Let's now head over to our top story and of course the focus of today's show, and that is on India's space tech startup ecosystem that is ready to shoot for the skies. In fact, the sector, which until 2014 was restricted to government activity, has seen a plethora of startups and new age companies come up. At least 190 startups are currently operating in this space, and it is these companies that are driving key innovations in the entire spectrum of the space sector to compete at a global scale. So no wonder then that funding has also seen a jump from $118 million in 2022 to $126 million in 2023. The year 2024 has received $10.8 million till now. What's also helped the sector is government's easing of FDI norms in the sector and allowing for 100% overseas investment. So the big question that we'll be taking across to our guests who joined right now is if India's startup startup tech sector is ready for a lift-off. And of course, to discuss that further, I'm now joined by Srinath Ravichandran, co-founder and CEO, Agnikul Cosmos, and Winnie Shekhar, partner, IndusLaw. Thank you very much, Winnie, and of course, Srinath, for joining us here on ET Now. I want to first start with you, Srinath. This is certainly an exciting time for space startups. In fact, the Prime Minister himself posted a congratulatory message for Agnikul after you successfully demonstrated your rocket technology. So let me ask you a bit about how difficult has it been, given that there's a lot of complexity in the sector. There are those kind of costs as well. How has the journey been so far?
I think we can really categorize the journey into two phases. There was a phase before the InSpace initiative was announced, and there is a phase after InSpace was announced. And I think the first part of it, like basically before 2020, I would say when it was announced, there were a lot of questions. People even asked us questions like, will we ever be allowed to launch a private rocket from India? Will we be allowed to set up our launch pads? And a lot of hesitation generally about doing this from India, particularly for me, because I used to be in the US before coming here to do this. But on the other hand, I think after 2020, 2021, particularly with the formal inauguration of InSpace, all those questions have gone away. In fact, I think the government has gone all the way to allow us to set up our own private launch pad itself within ISRO's Sriharikota complex. Investors are, accepting that. Vendors are accepting that. Customers are accepting that. So it's almost like a tale of two phases, literally. And now we are in a phase where the regulatory framework is so open that if you want to go and do something, you can do it. Like, it is possible to build a SpaceX kind of a company in India. At least regulation is not going to come your way.
So regulation has not come in the way of the growth of startups, and of course we'll be taking that point about regulation in just a short while from now. Let me get in the opening comments from Winnie as well. Now, the opening up of the space economy, Winnie, we are also seeing nations around the world have recognized the strategic and economic importance of space. The Prime Minister has himself spoken about the fact that India will be a growing economy and will be a commercial hub as far as space is concerned. But what's really driving this interest, and what opportunities opportunities, the new sea for India, even as we are seeing global economic shifts happen?
Like Srinath was mentioning, the way the government is looking at this right now is very different from how it looked at it in the past decade or even in the last 5 years. It's been a massive boom with a huge amount of support for the sector itself. By opening up FDI, which is what was, something that was actually making all investors very jittery about India, I think the government has gotten us to a great start in this segment because once we have foreign players come in and put in money for our research and development and support regulatory framework, the regulatory framework, like Srinath was mentioning, is going to be a huge boost once we allow private participation in the segment. And I think the reason for the new interest in this segment is the amount of support it is getting from government, the kind of talented ecosystem that we have now developed, including all the startup community beyond ISRO and InSpace. Because once you also have commercial wings from ISRO has continuously maintained that beyond them, it'll always be the private players who would also be contributing immensely to the growth of the Indian space economy. I think that would be what we could start with.
Yes, Winnie, and a very, very valid point made about, the opening up of the sector. And let me take that point across to Srinath. Now, Srinath, related to the sector, the point about opening up of the sector, how big a change is the recent amendment in, higher FDI limits for the sector mean? What does it really do to investments in the space? And how does it really help startups like yourselves in terms of liquidity, considering that that is a big factor as far as the success of startups in this space is concerned, besides, of course, longevity?
I think once that part of it is clear, there is a lot more participation from investors even in the country because people know that you can raise larger rounds of funding. And typically, the notion in the market is unless FDI is permitted, large rounds of funding may not be easily possible. So very interestingly, even though FDI is opening up, you won't be benefited only from FDI. You will actually be benefited more from the internal people as well, because that gives them the confidence that at some point in time that external cap is also available for us. I think the second part is the sector has been normalized in a way, if you know what I mean, because it has really become like any other sector in some sense. You can raise money and you can do the work, and no one is going to stop you if you're doing the right things. And I think in that sense, it is a way to bring space back down to earth from an investor community standpoint. That will really help all of us.
Right, and in fact, when you speak about giving a push to the sector is concerned, the Prime Minister also stated that by 2035, India will have its own space station. And of course, in 10 years, India's space economy will go 5x to become $44 billion. But very important point you raise about investors, Srinath. So what kind of a confidence has this given the recent budgetary allocation of 1,000 crores, of course, the opening up of the FDI, and of course, the kind of moves that we're seeing by the government as far as policy in the space is concerned? What kind of confidence has that given to investors? Give us a sense of that. What are the kind of conversations that you're having with investors, and what is their opinion on this overall?
New fund that have been, funds that have been announced for space tech specifically is actually signifying two things, right? One is that the government is not just simply supporting from a policy standpoint. There is money on the table that they are willing to back the right companies with. So I think that's a huge positive. It just like with investors, that is general investors, it is taken up very well because they know that the government is extremely serious. I mean, it's one thing to say you opened up policy, but it's another thing to say actually money is available for supporting startups. The next thing is also that the usual questions that we get asked about, is this a temporary thing, or how real is this actual support? I think there is nothing more measurable in terms of support if it's given that there is cash support itself. Right. So I think the whole thing has become much more quantified now, as opposed to only being in the paperwork realm. So, yeah, very positive. We're getting lesser and lesser questions about whether the government is really going to be a problem. I think usually we have those and then we're able to address it in the last 2 years. But now with this new announcement, even those have gone away completely.
Right. And, Winnie, let me take that question across to you now. Now, when the Prime Minister said that India's space economy will grow 5x to become $44 billion, and of course, it'll become a global commercial hub, give us a sense of the kind of size of this market and the revenue potential that there is in this space from your perspective and your point of view.
I think the numbers speak for themselves, and currently we're at around 8-9 billion, and the revenue in the global economy is more than 450 billion. So I think we are at around 2%, and we want to grow up to 10%. And 10% could be a much larger number on the relevant date, because we are talking about 10 years from today, because the number of things in the space sector itself is increasing day by day. And I'm sure Srinath can add to that in terms of the kind of things that we saw 4 years back versus the kind of innovative products and services in which I'm seeing term sheets today. It's so different in terms of, I think India was not even talking about, say, a reusable launch vehicle, but we are talking about so many new avenues of revenue and commercialization of space. So I think the sector is only growing and at a very consistent rate. So I think in terms of revenue, 44 billion may also be a smaller number in terms of what we aim to achieve in 10 years. It could actually be 50 to 60 billion.
Okay, well, that's the estimate. 50 to 60 billion in a couple of years is what your estimate really is. But Srinath, which sectors are seeing a demand surge as far as the space economy is concerned? And secondly, I want to get your view on how can Make in India initiative, which has seen several sectors get subsidy schemes to get a boost. How can this Make in India initiative really give a boost to the space sector even further?
I think the more space tech gets commoditized, it's more seen as any other sector. I think everything that has held the manufacturing sector here will also help the space sector, right? So I think in that sense, Make in India is definitely going to be great for the space sector people as well. I think also there's a lot of push for building original stuff in India, building original hardware in India, building original space tech software in India. And I think that is also going to indirectly or directly help the Make in India movement, because if things are conceived here, obviously it will be built here as well. So from both the regular manufacturing kind of world to the actual, let's say, design in India to Make in India shift, both of them are actually going to be helping all of us here.
All right. And Srinath, also let me know, I mean, of course, it is ISRO which is given rocket fuel to boost this sector, with successful launches, including that of Chandrayaan. But where do India's strengths lie?
India's strengths lie, I think, in 3 aspects, right? There's a lot of original innovation that has happened in the country, so which is obviously starting off from ISRO. But I think there are a lot more people also working on it today. So that is a big boost because you're building all of this in India itself. Second, I think people have come up with these, it's a method of thinking in terms of how you go about mission planning, how you go about testing and so on. And I think we do it in an extremely capital efficient way. And I'm not talking about the general typical India advantage that people associate, capital efficiency with, because infra is cheap and, sometimes even the labor is cheap and so on. I'm talking about conceiving strategies and programs that are actually inexpensive, and hence your missions turn out to be inexpensive. That's number 2. And I think number 3, there are a lot of people across the country who are, space enthusiasts, very passionate about space. And I think all of them are actually going to be directly adding value to this ecosystem as well. So in that sense, we're very uniquely placed globally, I think, to actually become a world leader in this thing.
Right. Winnie, give us a sense of, given the kind of technological complexities that this sector has, as again somebody who wants to venture into the D2C space, this sector in particular has long gestation periods. It obviously takes a lot of time to set up a startup. And of course, as far as operations are concerned, there are those kinds of costs as well. So while the opening up of the sector is great, what more needs to be done from a policy perspective to give a further boost to private players, given that private players are now going to take the sector forward?
I would answer that question. Just one thing on the previous one. I think I was talking about the number in a 10-year period, not really in 2, 3 years. Just to answer what else could we do, I think we still are way behind the larger economies in terms of the budget allocation for the sector itself. And I'm sure everyone in the segment will agree that the budget allocation can get better, but that obviously is a factor of how Indian economy grows as well overall. That's one thing which could really boost the sector a lot. In terms of obviously opening private participation, and like Srinath mentioned, it would also lead to more domestic players having more sentimental value attached in terms of being wanting to invest in the segment more, believing in the segment more. That is going to really help, because otherwise the segment has a very frugal mentality, which actually leads to the cost efficiency that we have been talking about. The other thing would be boosting education in the segment per se. I think that also is going to really help in creation of talent. Because I'm a lawyer, I'm going to also say making laws clearer in terms of who can launch, whether there would be any timelines, expectations in terms of any approvals that would be required, because the government has been super supportive for all startups in terms of being able to give them full leverage in terms of uh, uh, products, services, everything. If there could be more clarity in terms of any permissions, any kind of regulatory framework that startups will have to navigate through, that would also be super helpful. And I think maybe a commitment from the government in terms of procurement, because like we talked about, there is longevity in terms of R&D and everything else. The segment is gonna be commercially viable, but it also has a longer gestation period. So some commitment from the government in terms of procurement, in terms of saying that, defense and the Department of Telecom is gonna procure so much from space segment startups, that would also be great, I guess.
Right. Right. So very, very valid points when you mention about, boosting education to research in the sector, and of course, continuous support, given that this comes under, deep technology startups. But Srinath, what kind of budgets as an industry player do you see should be allocated to the sector, and what kind of assistance, further assistance, would you need as far as policy is concerned if India has to reach the milestone that Prime Minister has spoken about?
I think from a budget standpoint, by just opening up the sector to private players, money is flowing into the country, but just not through the government, right? So development work in space tech is happening. It's just that before it used to be only through government money, taxpayers' money, but now private avenues, private players are also coming into the picture, which means that is also a way to develop technology. So I think it's a brilliant move by the government to enable that. In a way, indirectly, money that is being spent into development of space technology in India has increased. It is just that it has taken another channel. That's it. And I also believe that one of the best reasons why ISRO has been able to be so powerful at frugal innovation is always you've been on a slightly lower side in the budget. Now that said, whether the current number of whatever 15,000 crores, 20,000 crores, whatever those numbers are, whether that's right or not right, really depends again on a case by case basis. But I would generally say that it has helped India also in some way. Now, coming to what more can be done on the policy front to support startups, I think, a lot of things have already been opened up right now. I think the next set of challenges are really going to be about bringing in efficiencies, because the first set of regulatory, mechanisms that have been put in place are about opening gates, right, or about going from 0 to 1. So that has already come in. So there are things now that are moving. There are things that you know what to do. Now,
so
obviously,
Srinath, when you say bringing in efficiencies, what does that really mean? Where do you want these efficiencies to be brought in, and what kind of efficiencies are you speaking about?
Yeah, so for example, so far, there is policy that is available or already there to say you can do one launch or you can do 2 launches, right? Now, maybe the next set of things to work on is how do we get approval for, multiple launches at a time? Like I think I've heard other countries or sometimes actually do it if all your missions are similar. That's one way to say that we don't need to go for each and every launch for approval, but at the same time, you get a package approval in a way if you're within a certain set of constraints. Similarly, the same thing could be done for satellite operations. The same thing could be done for multiple tests and so on. Because we were in a phase where we didn't even know if things were allowed. Now things have been allowed, and there is always a scope to say now things can be allowed in an even more easier way. So that is what I meant by more efficiency. We've gone from 0 to 80, and then 80 to 100 is always there to keep on playing in terms of making things easier, better, more effective, and so on.
And definitely, Srinath, it is eventually going to be about, the implementation of those policies that the government has announced, whether it was in the budget or opening up of the FDI or further support. It really is going to be about implementation of those. But before we wrap this discussion up, I want to ask from you, now that, your launch has happened and you've demonstrated your capabilities, what is it that you're focusing on next as far as Agnikul is concerned?
Going commercial, all the technologies that we really are trying to bring to the table were packaged into one launch, and that was a very successful flight and nominal mission. So now we know that we have the tools. Now we'll have to package it in a way where it'll actually add value to customers. It'll give them flexibility to launch from in the launch timelines they want, with the cost they want, and so on. So that's our focus: getting commercial.
Commercial is going to be what you're looking at. On that note, thank you very much, Srinath, and thank you very much, Winnie, for taking the time out. I know, Srinath, you were in a meeting and you had to come out to be on air with us. So thank you very much once again for joining us. Thank you, Winnie, for joining us as well. And ladies and gentlemen, India's space sector is at a pivotal juncture. A booming private sector and, of course, a supportive regulatory environment. The nation is certainly poised for a significant leap forward. On that note, it's time's up on Startup Central. You can also catch our show clips on etnownews.com and, of course, on YouTube on ET Now. And do share them with your friends if you find value in what we bring to you. In fact, on that note, goodbye and thank you very much for staying with us. Hope you like the show as much as we did putting it together for you.